But my name is Niklas Swanström. I'm heading the Institute for Security and Development Policy. It's a great pleasure actually to invite you here. We have a very interesting forum today. We're going to talk about Chinese investments, infrastructure influence in Europe, the global context. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to have Dr. Ferchen to start with a short introduction for 10 minutes. And then we will invite two distinguished panelists, Ms. Maria Åsenius and Jonas Hallberg. Maria Åsenius is the head of the cabinet for EU Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, as well as the former State Secretary of the Prime Minister's Office. And Jonas Hallberg is the Trade Policy Advisor and Legal Advisor at the National Board of Trade in Sweden. And his, before that, was at the Sweden Upper Administration Court for Appeal at the Swedish Ministry of Justice and Foreign Affairs. It's much easier to say in Swedish. Translation is bad today. I think it's a fantastic opportunity because Matt is one of the most distinguished experts on this topic, and normally he would be he's a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, where he focuses on China developing world program, and he runs it. And I think that to have an outside perspective, as much as the American perspective is an outside perspective, on Europe and China is going to be extremely interesting. So without much further ado, Matt, I would like to invite you up and hold the presentation. And afterwards we will take the seats there and have a presentation. I would also ask you to turn off the sound if you don't turn off the telephone. That's pure politeness. And when you ask questions afterwards, I kindly ask you to keep short questions. Very short questions. If you have to ask a long question, think about it once more and ask a more precise question. So, Matt, the floor is yours.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Niklas, and thanks for all of you coming over and joining us today. I'm looking forward to being here, my second time in Stockholm, but really the first chance to talk with a broader audience about some of these issues. As Niklas mentioned, my background is actually on China's relationship with a few other regions of the world, including Latin America. I do a lot of work on China and Venezuela, but in the last couple of years I have been doing more looking at sort of developments in the United States and then more recently in Europe in terms of rethinking what the relationship with China should be. So the first part of my presentation today is going to be going into what I see as some of the drivers behind this pushback. Why we're even here talking about things like investment screening and China's industrial policy. So I'll talk a little bit about why I think we've seen this rethinking and sort of pushback on both sides of the Atlantic. Then I'll talk a little bit about why there are some tensions in that pushback, or in what some are calling a consensus about the need to rethink the relationship with China again on both sides of the Atlantic. And then I will talk a little bit more about the specifics of China, Europe, and industrial policy and issues related to investment screening, and I'll conclude with just a few thoughts about longer-term prospects for research and policy, especially in terms of transatlantic cooperation. So let me jump right in on this question of what it is that is driving the rethink, again, on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm going to be vague. I'm not going to talk that much about the specifics of what's happening in the U.S. versus what I see broadly happening in Europe, and do that kind of on purpose because I imagine you'll think, well, that doesn't really relate to Sweden, or that's much more American thing, but I think that's a useful thing to folks to talk about afterwards. So there are 5 different groups and sets of issues that I think are driving the pushback and revised consensus on the US side. And there are a couple terms that I think are useful here and that we see, especially in press, but also in government documents about this. The EU talking about China as a systemic rival, among other things, and in the United States talking about China as a strategic competitor. So the 5 sets of groups and the sort of issues that they're thinking about. First is the business community, broadly speaking, with concerns about things like market access, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and broadly speaking about the direction of China's industrial policy and how it is that the Chinese government is marshaling resources through its state-owned enterprises to support that industrial policy, both domestically and abroad. The second set of concerns is related to national security. Questions such as strategic or critical technology or infrastructure, and broadly speaking about China's use of what many are terming geoeconomics. So for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative as a kind of Trojan horse. China says it's a commercial development project, but pushback and criticism that we've seen from some parts has basically said, no, it's more than that. It is also a geopolitical strategy for China to gain influence. And I would argue that much of the action in terms of the rethinking of relationships and this idea of China as a strategic competitor or a systemic rival is at this intersection of business concerns and security type concerns. 3 other categories that I'll just briefly mention that I think are also playing into this discussion. Those concerned about human rights. This includes those thinking about the way in which China is using new technologies for surveillance and control within China itself, and much of the focus, at least recently, on the region of Xinjiang in China. The 4th category, academics, and I think this is one that is maybe doesn't get as much attention, but academics in the United States, in Europe, concerned about questions of censorship inside of China, concerned about issues of academic freedom in China, and then also concerned about the potential for Chinese students who are studying abroad to have their own academic freedom curtailed potentially, or for them to call for certain kinds of topics not to be discussed at various campuses. So concerns, broadly speaking, among the academic community on both sides of the Atlantic. And then the media, which amplifies almost all of these issues, and where there are particular concerns that are long-standing about the treatment of journalists and the freedom of journalists to operate inside of China itself. And then a couple of key policymakers who themselves are now part of the decision-making process in some countries, who were former journalists. So Matt Pottinger in the case of the United States, or John Garneau in the case of Australia, people who had experience as journalists in China and are now decision-makers and part of some of this process, thinking about the need to reassess the relationship with China in their respective countries. The nature of these problems, I think, falls into 2 general categories. The first of them is the sense that China's economic and maybe political liberalization has either stalled or gone into reverse. So on many of these issues that I just mentioned, a lot of them are not new, especially on the business side, questions of tech transfer, market access, intellectual property rights. A lot of those are not new, but there's a sense that if there was a positive direction of reform in the past, that has stalled out again or gone into reverse. And on the sort of side of things going into reverse, a lot of what's pointed out here is in the area of the Chinese government doubling down on the commitment to state-owned enterprises instead of reducing the role of state-owned enterprises in the economy, and in relationship to industrial planning, that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping has decided that it is going to prioritize state-owned enterprises and industrial policy. And then there's a separate category of that. Those are the categories that are sort of either where reform has stalled or gone into reverse, and then a couple of other categories of concern about what is new and unwanted. And the first of those relates to the domestic, both economic and political situation in China. And this is probably most focused on Xi Jinping himself and the idea that he is now going to be in the position at the head of the party and the government for a very long time. And that process of 10-yearly transition has now been jettisoned. And the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is increasingly involving itself in all aspects of Chinese economy and society in ways that maybe were more limited in the past. And then on the foreign policy side, the idea that China is increasingly assertive. And you see this language and concern focused largely in military terms on the South China Sea, and then on this idea of China's foreign economic policies on the Belt and Road. So that there's this kind of new approach that China is taking to foreign policy, and again to the extent that it is a trigger for some of this pushback, the sense that something is new and worrisome. Some of the solutions and remedies that we see out there are quite prominent. In the case of the United States, the tariffs and the trade negotiations, trade war, that's clearly part of it. Export controls, also part of this, and then investment screening. So largely defensive measures in the case of the United States. And then along with this, I think there is a general trend of trying to prepare publics for a very different attitude and approach toward China. And I think we see this certainly in the Trump administration in the United States. So that's the sort of broad pushback and reasons for it. And at the end there, I sort of alluded to one thing that you're probably wondering about, which is clearly the role of politics, and I'll go into that a little bit more here. Because I think when we ask ourselves, what is it that's changed where? I think clearly, at least in the case of the United States, we have the Trump administration, which has, I think, opened the floodgates for some of these long-standing issues, and that at least has a major impact on what we see in terms of the ability of those with these various sets of concerns and grievances to be able to try to get some sort of change. Let me talk just a little bit about some of the challenges to this consensus that I see that are out there. The first one is that there's a fundamental tension or contradiction in the logic of cooperation and engagement and the logic of this pushback that I just mentioned. From the business point of view, making money, what most businesses want, even if they are concerned about this broad set of issues that I just mentioned about market access, for instance, they want more, not less market access. They would like to do more, not less business. And at least at the nexus of economic and security concerns, a lot of, I think, what people are asking is, where do we draw the line in terms of making a profit versus protecting national security? So we see this fundamental tension running throughout discussions about what the balance should be between continued engagement, especially on the economic side of things, and then scrutiny of the security risks and concerns about China's broader role in the world. I think also generally we see this reflected in the question of the way that even if problems are generally identified and you can see some consensus on those, the question of what solutions should be put into place is quite different. And I think we see this represented relatively clearly in discussions about 5G and Huawei and debates throughout Europe about what countries should do. The United States has a fairly clear message on this, but there's a lot of variation in the responses that we see, especially in Europe. In terms of trends in the US consensus, I think that we are going to see potential for change as we go into, or at least a variation in different views as we go into, get deeper into the 2020 election cycle. So I think we will see the Democratic Party and certain candidates at the presidential level, but also in Congress, coming forward with different viewpoints about how to engage with China. This is a very sensitive issue, I think, for candidates at the moment. The tone has certainly changed in the United States, so it's hard for anyone to move away from a fairly kind of hawkish position. But I think there may be very different approaches coming in from different candidates, thinking about what the best way to engage with China might be going forward. So I would keep your eye on that. I think in Europe we also see that there is some tension, or at least differences, running throughout the European Union members, even though we have new platforms on connectivity, for instance, or on investment screening. The real question going forward is how are those going to be implemented once we have these sort of broad guidelines in place? How will that go forward? Will there be unity, or will there be variation as those are ruled out? Let me talk then a little bit about industrial policy and questions of investment screening in particular. First, just a few comments about what China wants in Europe. I think fairly clearly markets continue to be a major focus. And this is sort of changing. What kinds of markets does China want? China wants, as it tries to upgrade its own manufacturing sector to more high-tech, from being a place that assembles products to a place that creates technology and sells it. It sees Europe as a place both for markets for that, but where it can also potentially have collaboration or purchase kind of technology. So infrastructure, technology, and in general value-added kinds of things. And there's an obvious differentiation between Northern and Western Europe, where there are more of these high-tech companies, including in Sweden, and then places where infrastructure kinds of projects are more prevalent in, say, Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. So, for instance, port projects in Greece. So we see differentiation in terms of region and what China might be looking for. Broad trends in industrial policy in China that are relevant for this discussion. There is, I think, a lot of focus on this question of China's 2025 platform that is, I think, going to be going forward still the core focus for China as a result of the trade negotiations with the United States. I'd say there's been a bit of a downgrading on the sort of the PR side of things on the Chinese side, to not emphasize as much 2025, but I think that's firmly in place. I don't think China's going to, in the near term, move away from its industrial planning strategies, especially when it comes to technology development. I want to talk just for a second about some of the responses to U.S. demands when it comes to this broad set of concerns on market access, on intellectual property rights, and on technology transfer. First of all, on technology transfer, the Chinese government is very consistent about saying that the government does not demand technology transfer. It never has, it never will. If technology transfer happens, it's at a firm-to-firm level and usually cooperative. So the response when the United States and others say we're worried about technology transfer, the government on the Chinese side is relatively consistent, saying, well, we don't demand that. In terms of one of the key responses as part of the negotiations for China has been to put in place a new FDI law. Recently, I was able to travel with a U.S. congressional delegation to China, and the response of many of our high-level counterparts was quite interesting in this regard. They said, look, we have this new FDI law. Many of the issues and approaches within this new FDI law are good for you, they're good for us. They help us continue with our broad reform strategy. You're asking us to give more market access. We think more market access is great, and this is what the FDI law is going to do. However, they say it's going to take a while to put this into place. So they're responding positively to the concerns raised by the United States, but I think we can expect the process will be drawn out in terms of implementation. And then just broadly, this response that what is being asked for in terms of structural reform, which is a key term in the negotiations. The Chinese response has tended to be, we love structural reform. We've been doing structural reform for the last 40 years. We're committed to it. We're going to continue to do it. Thank you for asking. But then the question is, how is that going to play out, the specifics, and whether or not that is a sort of delaying tactic. So all of these issues would tend to give us pause in terms of how quickly or comprehensively we might expect responses or fundamental changes as part of at least these trade negotiations that are happening. I would also say, though, that the general sense that economic reform in China is done, that it cannot happen again. I think this is overly pessimistic. I think this tends to be the attitude among some in business communities in West, in the United States and in Europe. But I think this might be premature. I think at the moment there's a lot of reason for pessimism about this, but I think there are various reasons why we might expect if things change in terms of the political will in China, if there's a sense that the doubling down on the state role in the economy is not getting China what it wants in terms of economic growth and sustainability, that we might see a reconsideration again of the need for some of these kinds of liberalizations on the economic side. Let me talk just briefly about screening and then I'll conclude. So screening of investments is one of the key issues at play, and clearly this is one of the topics where the United States is asking countries in Europe, including in Sweden, to think more about their own investment screening processes, especially for high-tech kinds of goods, and again, at this intersection of business and security. Some thoughts about this. I think that having screening processes in place makes a great deal of sense, and having processes that are implementable is also important. I think that if you have this process in place, for it to be fully effective, I think it is going to have to be EU-wide. So if your neighbors or other countries are not doing the same, then what if Chinese firms or any other firms can go to countries that do not have the same screening processes? This is a concern throughout the EU. And I think the question of the scope of screening is really important, at least to my mind. The range of issues, what is considered to be strategic or critical infrastructure or technology. I think the bar should be high for these things, because if it's too expansive, then you end up needing to screen for too many things. I think it needs to be non-discriminatory in the sense that even if China looms large in the background, there needs to be a sense that these processes and rules apply to all foreign investment. And then I think there needs to be, and this may be the hardest of all, a real focus on not politicizing the process. Because this could definitely lead to a protectionist spiral where some firms or sectors say, well, my industry or my firm is strategic or critical, and therefore I need certain kinds of scrutiny or protection. And you can imagine that just building and building. And certainly this would not be a positive trend. Let me conclude then with just a few comments about bigger picture issues. Much of what I've talked about here, and I think much of what is at play in terms of this pushback and consensus, that there needs to be more of a balance between engagement and caution on especially the security side of things, is that these tend to be short-term and defensive. There, I believe, is a sense that all of this language of needing to defend and preserve and to worry about the potential threats from China is very much one that is reflected in some worries about one's own strengths, and I see this certainly in the United States. It's very defensive in a lot of ways. I think it's very short term. And I think all countries who are rethinking this relationship with China also need to think longer term and in terms of the kinds of things that are going to be strengths going forward rather than some of these just purely short-term issues. So not just defense, but also sort of what are the positive things that countries can do to compete in the longer run. And in this, I think there is a lot of room for more transatlantic cooperation, both in terms of the real challenges of these issues. Many of these issues are very technical. We see this in the 5G Huawei debates, for example, and I think this is also going to be the case with investment screening. I think so many of these topics are very complex and technical. I think there needs to be more discussion, both at an academic level and at a policy level, and I think especially in the transatlantic space, there is a lot of room to do this. Not many of these discussions are taking place. And then, of course, with other partners in Asia who are also thinking about and have a lot of experience with this. I would point to countries like Japan or Taiwan or Singapore also as partners in these discussions. So I will conclude with that and very much look forward to our discussion and your comments. Thank you.
So I would ask the panelists to take seats. So the way we're going to do this is to start out as a bit of a discussion for roughly half an hour, and then we will continue with questions from the audience. And I still repeat, try to keep it very short. But Matt, how do you characterize the aims of the Chinese investment in Europe? How much is driven by politics and how much is driven by economics? I mean, this is something we sort of tend to read in media all the time, but what would your perception be? And Maria, I will keep this informal. Looking at the US-China relationship here and the increased risk of trade war, protectionism, and all of this, can we prevent this in Europe? Can we actually, I mean, Europe and especially Sweden is so dependent on free trade. This is something that is essential for us. How do we manage to secure our own interests, be that political or economic, but at the same time increasing trade? And then Jonas, of course, Matt said that the screenings are extremely technical, and but I'm sure you can try to boil it down to something more understandable. But you wrote this report for the National Trade Board about the differences in perception of among the Nordic countries in terms of screening. And there are major national differences between the Nordic countries. I mean, where do you find the gaps to be the most significant? And also, I mean, maybe in this, Matt mentioned that we need a Europe-wide approach. And I assume that when it comes into Europe, the difference is going to be wider. You know, how do we manage to handle it and to bridge those differences? And maybe Matt wants to start with the first question.
That is probably, I mean, this is the question that everyone around the world is asking themselves. So I do a lot of work on China, Latin America, and this is what people have been asking for the last decade plus. And I think you begin that discussion almost everywhere by saying, well, there are commercial interests, there are business interests, many of which make sense. Even if we look in Sweden and we think about the Volvo transaction, and you think, okay, China's having a difficult time with its own automobile sector in terms of branding and getting kind of national champion recognition in the same way that maybe Japan car companies or Korean car companies were able to do this. So you acquire a famous foreign brand and you then solve the problem in that way. And my general perception is that this is deemed as one of the more successful acquisitions, at least here. So you begin with these sort of commercial considerations, which are, you know, some of them are not that controversial. And then you start to get into other areas where there's this balance of security issues, or where the question of whether a certain kind of acquisition is at the same time strategic or critical, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's a kind of technology, whether there's a sector or a firm in a country that is so important to that country's economic future that then you have to consider this. And then whether or not China meant that as an effort to sort of completely dominate a sector, it might do so. And then there are other areas where it is clear that China does have political ambitions. I think we see this in terms of structures like 16+1 or now 17+1 in Central and Eastern Europe, where there is an effort there to try to get friends from formerly socialist countries, also at different levels of economic development, where kinds of approaches that China has might be better. And then we see other issues that are also strategic, say, for instance, in the Arctic Circle, and China's hopes to have a role there. So I think it really varies, and I don't think there's any one answer to this question, but a lot of the question of, say, investment screening or issues like Huawei and 5G, they come down to having an answer to this, and I think these need to be discussions that happen at every country, because there are these differences, and the answers are going to be different.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, of course, we are looking at the escalating conflict between US and China with great concern, because, well, we worry that this is actually bad for all of us and it can tip the global economy into a recession. We are worried also because what these two countries may agree, and there are very few leaks from these negotiations, surprisingly, but what they may agree in the end, we worry that this is something that will not respect the WTO framework and multilateral rules. For example, we fear that one component will be what we call managed trade, that China promises to buy XYZ from the US at the back of everybody else. Even if we have more competitive products in Europe, China will buy them from the US. And we're also a bit afraid that the US will institutionalize what I would also call illegal tariffs. I've heard USTR Lighthizer say that even if there will be a deal between the two countries, there may still be some tariffs in place, or an immediate threat of reinstitutionalizing of these tariffs as soon as the US deems that China does not deliver. All this worry us a lot. There could be another component, though, and that is something that would be good for all of us, and that is if there is an agreement on more systemic change that Matt talked about earlier, fairer rules that would benefit the entire world. But overall, I'm not worried that the Europeans will walk down the same path as President Trump. I don't think he's a role model in trade negotiations. From a European perspective, I think instead we have a very ambitious bilateral negotiating agenda where we build trust and confidence between ourselves and third partners. Trade agreements is about trust and confidence and creating win-win situations, in our view. And of course we are also working very hard to strengthen and modernize the rules in the WTO, notably actually together with the United States and with Japan. Because by and large, we agree with the American analysis of what is a problem in the Chinese economy. And the root causes of the global tensions we see today in the area of trade it really starts in China. It is because China notably is not a market economy. The way it has grown very fast, and it has grown in a way that we also consider unfair. The massive industrial subsidies, the forced technology transfers, the growing role of state-owned enterprises, the overcapacity, the bad protection of IPR. I mean, I can agree to everything that Matt said about these things. And when it comes to security, I have seen a tremendous change in Europe in the last couple of years only. And I think that explains why EU member states agreed in record time that we should have an investment screening mechanism. We can still discuss whether the scope is enough or whatever, but at least that growing awareness led to this record fast adoption, I think 15 months, and that is in EU terms very quick for agreeing on legislation. At the same time, we have to bear in mind that national security is very much a national competence, close to each country's national sovereignty. So we will have a framework that allows new member states to share analysis and exchange information, and the Commission will also play a role. But in the end, each member state decides whether it should block a certain investment because of national security. So I expect that we will see some variation between member states also in the future. And just a final little note, I visited Gothenburg, my hometown, myself, together with Commissioner Swanström last year, and we were all consumed with investment screening, and we have to be better at protecting ourselves. And then we talked to somebody from Volvo who said, oh gee, fantastic. They bring knowledge. They are at the forefront. We would not have managed to make these cars without the Chinese knowledge. And we were like, So, there is a lot to take in here. Thank you.
I'll start with comments from previous speakers. Sorry, don't you hear?
Closer to the mouse, maybe.
It's better? Great. Well, from my perspective, we're talking about two different things here. One is the level playing field, or lack of level playing field, both when it comes to the market inside China, but also now lately years when they're making heavy investments outside of China. And thank you, that was not short. So when it comes to within China, it's the question of market access for investments, and now we're talking about investments and not trade. And when it comes to the Chinese investments abroad, we're talking about heavily subsidized investments, which is also creating problems from the perspective of a level playing field. Those two investments can be in broad sense two types. One that is threatening national security, and the other one is that they are competing on different terms in comparison to European or American investors in Europe. So both these things were a driving force behind the negotiations of the European regulation. But in the end, the Commission decided to only take up one of those problems, and that was, of course, the security side. Right now, there are 14 European countries that have investment screening mechanisms, and they are very diverse in many perspectives. So, as Maria said, when it comes to the regulation, it gives room for that diversity. But what it does not give room for is the grounds for a rejection of an investment. It needs to be either security or public order. And this is not to be confused with public order and security, which is another European concept. And these two grounds that you can find in the regulation come from the WTO. With the aim of giving room for countries to have their own way. And this could of course be misused as well. So this is something that we will see for the future. Maria was talking about the competence. So what we now have is a regulation that on one hand takes care of sort of the frames of when you can say yes or no, and at the same time we're touching upon subjects that the member states have not given competence to the countries, to the EU. So we will see how that will play out in the future. And when I started to look at the Nordic countries and the investment screening mechanisms, it was of course with the perspective that during these negotiations in the EU, I have been aiding the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs from the very beginning to the very end. As Maria said, it was a very fast process in comparison. So first of all, I looked at the Finnish system. That's the only Nordic country with sort of a developed investment screening mechanism. This probably due to the relationship to Russia. Even so, they are in the process of modernizing that mechanism and in some perspectives adapting it to the EU regulation. But then when I looked at the Swedish system, to no surprise for many of you here, there is no investment screening mechanism at all. The closest thing that we have is the Protective Security Act. And in the current version, I would say there is nothing that you can be used. There is a suggestion in the form of a state report, Statens offentliga utredningar, to modernize this and go into that direction of an investment screening mechanism, but still quite far away from a developed version. Norway is somewhere in between. They have an investment screening mechanism when it comes to critical infrastructure, but apart from that, not much. The Danish system is also lacking an investment screening mechanism, but they have some versions that is used in sectors such as gas, for example, Nord Stream. So the diversity is great, but since the regulations now put the frames on the national systems, we will for sure see a conversion. I hope that was...
Well, I can use this. I'm going to be quick. Matt, you mentioned the Huawei, of course, and of course we can spend a lot of time talking about trials and everything, but Secretary of State Pompeo actually came out and said that if Europeans relied on Huawei technology, the United States might stop sharing intelligence with those European countries. And of course that puts a question mark on the transatlantic relationship and how that's going to develop. So what is your take on this? I mean, how could a situation like Huawei sort of influence the transatlantic relationship? And Maria, if I know you can't gossip maybe too much, but what is the latest news from the Commission when it comes into what is the latest discussions in the Commission regarding this? Chinese investments, there are people who are softer, of course, towards China. There are people who are tougher. What are the sort of discussions? What are the trends now? And now, of course, with Italy coming up, some would argue that Italy is a sign that the Chinese lobby has been much, much more effective and been sort of influenced. Is that the case? And then, of course, we come into 16+1. Is this sort of a creation that we should look up to or look up for, or should we encourage it? And then, of course, Jonas, the screening, and I'm thinking about now Sweden in particular, what are the characteristics of the Swedish screening mechanism? Is it primarily legal, political, or are there any other reasons sort of driving this forward? And as a final question to all of you is how do we, as European Union or Sweden, regulate investments in critical infrastructure at the same time as we keep the economic development? Because, of course, we want investments, we want strong economic cooperation, we want to have it, at least if you're Swedish, you want an open economy and a free economy. But what are the risks, political, economically, and how do we deal with this? Matt, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the Huawei 5G issue really sort of captures this tension and the predicament that European countries, and frankly no countries, I think, in the world want to be in, where you're being asked to choose, where you're in between an American option and a Chinese option, but that's where we are on this issue, and I think it's going to force a lot of thinking about how and whether or not countries around the world, including in Europe, might protect themselves from that. I think the reality is there's going to be more of these kinds of situations going forward, then how do you protect yourself from it? From the U.S. point of view, I think this is a broader dilemma as well in terms of American diplomacy. When it comes to pointing out to others concerns that the United States has with China, and much of it involves a lot of finger wagging, of saying, don't do this, you should worry about that. And then countries saying, well, what do you have as an alternative for us? And I think at the moment, much of this tends to be on the negative side. Well, don't worry about that, like, protect yourselves right now, and we'll figure this out later. But I don't think that's good enough. And then the question is, for any given country in Europe or as part of the EU, how do you come up with solutions to this? Is there a Swedish or a European-wide way that you can come up with an alternative on, say, 5G, and right now that doesn't seem to be possible, but the US doesn't have a complete alternative either, and I think this is where there's a variety of propositions on the table here, including the cost benefits that Huawei brings, balancing against the security concerns, and it's immediate, like decisions have to be made quickly. And a lot of that infrastructure is already in place. So I think this is one of the really tricky dilemmas, and at least in terms of U.S. diplomacy, I hope that there is more thinking about how to work cooperatively with allies rather than sort of creating this dilemma of putting countries between a rock and a hard place when it comes to China.
Yeah, that would be nice. I think the perspective in Europe, by and large, on China is changing rather rapidly, and it is not softening. I think there is an increasing awareness of the long-term challenges that results from the unlevel playing field that we talked about. And this influences our policy bilaterally, EU-China, multilaterally, the work we do in the WTO, and also EU internal policies, where I think the next thing we will look at, Jonas mentioned that the scope in the end was reduced for the investment screening. I think we will now look into what tools would serve us the best when it comes to trade policy tools or maybe competition policy tools, because in the internal market today we have strict rules for state aid, and we can prevent one member state from buying something in another member state if they use a lot of state aid. But we don't have the same tools if the third country, say China, come in buying something with help of a lot of state aid. There's a growing awareness about that, and we are actually currently discussing how to counter this best with what tools. So that is ongoing. I think we had an interesting EU-China summit last month, where we had a good show of unity among the EU 27, and I think we started to rebalance in some important aspects. But China is actually now committed to work on strengthening its rules on international subsidies, or the international rules. And also more result-oriented work on market access. We have agreed on a timeline to close our own negotiations, EU-China, and our investment agreement. And that is also important because that includes systemic structural change. When we talk about that we want national treatment, we mean national treatment. We mean that our investors should be treated as well as Chinese investors operating in China. So that's not a small thing. We have now committed to try to conclude by next year. China has also promised now to finally join the general procurement agreement also by next year. We should finalize the negotiation we have on geographical indications this year already. And by the way, in the joint agreement it also says that there should be no forced transfers of technology. At the same time, I recognize what Matt said before. We have heard promises before. To talk the talk is easy, but of course they have to walk the walk. And that's why I'm also happy we have a number of follow-up mechanisms now that we will really work on to make sure that China delivers. So of course the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say in the UK. So of course we will still see, but not a bad outcome in this EU-China summit. And of course we will keep reminding China that they have really gained so much from having a rules-based international system. They have maybe benefited more than anybody, so they should really now take responsibility for shoring up the system and therefore help changing the rules. It is in their own interest. And when it comes to other things you mentioned here, Italy, yes, it is true that the Italian position on investment screening changed from being one of the real hawks a couple of years ago to in the end abstaining when this regulation was adopted in the Council. Officially they motivated this by saying that the mechanism is too weak and it should be obligatory for all EU member states. But I frankly do think that it had something more to do with the recent memorandum of understanding signed between Italy and China on the Belt and Road. But anyway, I'm not too worried about this. We do think that because of our contacts with Rome that they will play ball in the implementation of the investment screening at technical level. It's now rolled out, so it will really start working as from October 2020, right, Jonas? Yeah. And then Huawei. Yes, you do put us in, between a rock and a hard place in a way with the statements like the ones from Pompeo. I mean, this is really not my area of expertise, but I understand that to just blanket block Huawei from operating in 5G in Europe would just be nonsensical, because we build 5G on top of 3G and 4G, and there Huawei is already involved, and it just wouldn't work. That is what I've been told. So what we have done now is it's a little bit the same thinking as with investment screening. A recommendation from the Commission to all member states to really make a proper risk analysis and see what parts of 5G that is really sensitive and what parts that are less sensitive, and where Huawei possibly should be blocked, or other companies. So I think that's where we are.
Yes, I was very happy to hear the news about the negotiations with China. When I started to work for the National Board of Trade in 2012, that was actually my first assignment, was to write about which priorities Sweden should have in these negotiations. And they have really been dragging on for a long time. And from my perspective, the reason is that the problem from the EU side has been that we want more market access in China. China already has the market access in Europe, so there's not been a lot of push-pull there. At the same time, the European countries that have felt the need to have an investment protection agreement with China already has it. The level of protection is high. And as far as I have understood, China wants a high level of protection in the treaty with the EU. I made an error there in my analysis 6 years ago. I thought that China wanted less, but they saw into the future and knew that they would have investments in Europe, and they do not trust European countries, or for that matter the EU, on the level that I anticipated. So when it comes to Sweden and the lack of an investment screening mechanism here, I would say that no matter political party in Sweden, none has felt that there had been a need for one. Not even when Nord Stream 2 requested access to Sweden Harbour at Gotland, even though the politicians were against this, there were not a lot of talk about creating an investment screening mechanism. And when the negotiations in Brussels started about creating a European regulation, Sweden being sort of the free trade Talibans of the North, said that we don't like this. But gradually, as the negotiations continued, and also the drafting changed a bit, Sweden became more and more positive. And I would say that we were quite constructive in the negotiations, and And also the Commission was very attentive to the suggestions. In the end, I think that we ended up with a fairly good regulation. So, is there a legal obstacle in Sweden? Of course, I don't know, but my guess is no, because when the state report about the Protective Security Act came, I think it was in December, a part of that act deals with acquisitions, and if you could make certain criteria for that, and they found that there was no problem with the Swedish law, and I assume that would be the same case if we were to create an investment screening mechanism here in Sweden. And when it comes to the regulation, Sweden, as all other countries, are required to fulfill some of these when it comes to gathering information and also sending information to the Commission and to other member states countries. So in reality, what Sweden needs to do is actually to create an investment screening mechanism. Then if we will actually also have a law saying that we could reject or not is another thing. But I would be very much surprised if the government do not take this opportunity, since they need to put in, they need to do another state report, and so yeah, that's my guess at least. Thank you.
So I will open up to the floor. 3 small bullet points to keep in mind. Identify yourself. Keep the question short. I do not want an essay around the question. And keep it to the topic. What happens in Venezuela and all that is interesting, but it's not today's topic, as an example. So identify yourself, keep it short, and keep it related to the topic. And with that, I will open up the floor to questions. Sir?
I'm Dragan from Serbia, and I would like to ask you one very simple question. Some of you mentioned Volvo. I would like to know and to clarify what is the positive and negative aspects. Nobody can tell now. And what could be the perspectives of China's presence in Volvo? Thank you.
I feel that Volvo is...
No, based on my little visit to Gothenburg last year, I mean, they needed new capital, they needed an injection. They got that, and on top of it, and that was the part that surprised me, that the Chinese brought new technology to the company.
Is it any security threats?
They don't think so.
No,
I would like to ask one question only. According to the Chinese strategy for war from many years ago, and it says you understand yourself as much as your enemy, then you will win the war. And I think the Chinese have studied the Western philosophy for many years, and many people know the way of living, the way of thinking of Western people. But what do you think the strategy of the Western people to understand the Chinese way of thinking?
how do you understand the Chinese?
So how do we understand? So here's one of the big misperceptions I think that's out there, and I associate this with Henry Kissinger a little bit. The idea that China is playing a different strategic game, that it thinks and acts long-term in a way that other countries don't, that it is able to put in place long-term strategies that other countries are not, in part because of its political system, but because of its culture and history. I mostly find that deeply unconvincing, but there is a way in which that argument has now affected, I think, some of what I was talking about in terms of this pushback and reassessment about China's sort of global threat. If we think about Belt and Road, for instance, there are a lot of, well, Belt and Road and industrial policy, I think, both fit into this. Basically saying, China's got a plan, it's global, it's strategic, watch out. What we see, however, both inside China and in terms of some of China's foreign policy, is that plans and policies don't necessarily align with outcomes. The Chinese government faces a huge range of challenges in implementing the kinds of things they want to. And even if we think about infrastructure development, which is at the core, for instance, of China's Belt and Road project, the social and economic dimensions of doing that within China are quite different than going to other countries and building infrastructure there. So one of the things that I tend to worry about more than those who say China's got a plan, it's going to implement it and is going to dominate, I worry about when plans don't align with outcomes, when there are unexpected outcomes, and you said not to mention Venezuela, but I do a lot of work on Venezuela. This is a prime example of where China miscalculated, didn't understand the political situation there. There was no plan in place for this to be the outcome, and China is harmed by what's happening as well. That doesn't fit with this narrative of China as kind of all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful. China faces a variety of challenges in its own domestic governance and on the international system. I think that is a key point that is far too often misunderstood in the United States and maybe in Europe.
The resignation of China. Other questions? Comments?
My name is Richard Steve from Central. I have a question to Matt. When we talk about the FDI, currently almost all countries has agencies dealing with FDI on the domestic industry. Today we are talking a lot about security, which in fact do not belong to the same ministry, although can be referred to the same country. I'm very grateful that you have given us a quite clear image and picture of the position of the US. For not a long time ago, when there's the friction between China and the US came, the people are saying that these two giants have trade conflict. Currently, everybody went to the other terminology, they say trade war. So my question is that, is it so that if China does not bow, the next step will be a military conflict?
Yeah, part of the reason that I lay out these 5 kind of categories of where I think the action is, and I do think that we see mirrors again on both sides of the Atlantic, is because I've been asking myself, what has changed? Something fundamental has changed in the US approach to China, and also I think we've talked about in the European approach, and it's been quick. It's happened, I think, sort of unexpectedly and quickly. All these issues were out there. Almost all of these issues, as I mentioned, existed before this pushback really started. So I've been sort of asking myself about this. And I see each element, say the business community, the national security community, and all the different agencies and other ways that we can sort of understand those. All of them have kind of coalesced. And at least in the United States, I think the trigger or the opening has been this change at the highest levels of politics, including in the Trump administration, which has tapped into a kind of populist concerns about globalization and openness and all of this. And what I worry about is that So, you know, you've got these business interests and they've got things that they want and they're willing to push back, and then you have national security interests. They're all kind of discrete and limited and reasonable enough as far as they go. But when they all coalesce, I worry that the incentive is to create a bigger enemy or national security threat that is beyond just these very discrete concerns. And the real variable here is politics. If you're going to get votes based on this, if you're going to play up the concerns, again, even if they're reasonable and relatively limited, and then you play them up and you play them up, I see this, for instance, in the way the United States got involved in Vietnam. You have some reasonable concerns here or there, and then before too long, the thing snowballs. So when I talk about the way in which the United States and Europe should have more discussion about this, I do think it is true, and I think there are a variety of very practical reasons to do that. But I also do worry about this sort of way in which you could bring into being an enemy as a result of this kind of cooperation. I don't think that would be good for anyone, but I see some of that language creeping into some of these discussions, and I think we need to be very cautious about that. Again, in part because 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about this in the same way, I don't think, even if all of these concerns were there. So I definitely do have worries about how this could escalate, and you could have self-fulfilling prophecies.
Can I just make a comment? And I have a question to Matt as well. In Europe, we have referred to China as a strategic partner for quite some time. But in the strategy paper that the Commission adopted before this EU-China summit, we now also talk about China as an economic competitor and a system rival. I think that's quite interesting. Matt, at the end of your initial presentation, you sounded rather pessimistic as concerns the ability of China to reform. But I'm wondering, doesn't it just have to reform? Because the economy is actually doing worse now because the state-owned enterprises have received too much of the loans at the expense of private companies that are actually more dynamic and better for the economy and for the growth that China actually needs. The private sector has been too squeezed, so don't they have to reform? Also to keep people happy. I mean, even if Xi Jinping is elected for, or has his post now for lifetime, he cannot ignore unemployment or unhappiness among his citizens.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and this gets at a bunch of bigger issues behind all of this. So I think, again, this assessment that China is acting in this sort of mercantilist sense because it has a world-beating plan and it's going to effectively put it in place. I think the consensus on the Chinese side that this is the way to go, that there should be more state involvement, that state-owned enterprises need to be the agent, that you need to do things like Belt and Road, which are hugely comprehensive and very state-heavy in terms of the focus and where the financing comes from in the company. I think there's much less consensus behind the scenes in China about that than we know. Even if we go back to right before Xi Jinping came into office in 2013, the World Bank and Li Keqiang and the Development Research Center at the State Council of China had another plan called China 2030, I believe, in which there was a broad agenda saying that there was basically a need to deepen reform. If China was going to make it past this thing that they were calling the middle income trap, that there needed to be deepened liberalization and move further away from the state world, that you had to have better functioning markets in China. That plan, associated with Li Keqiang, has obviously been set aside, and China 2025 is the one that's predominated. I think because of the political atmosphere in China, that we now, it's only been 5 years or so, but the sense that 2030 plan is just, that was a non-starter. Well, it was a prominent position, and I think a lot of people hoped that Xi Jinping would use his new consolidation of power to implement those ideas, liberalizations, and he hasn't. But I don't think that I think there's still a lot of people in China who think that original deepening of reform was the way to go. And then the question is, what barriers do you start to run up against as a result of this doubling down on the more state-oriented approach? There's a lot of waste involved in both the domestic aspects of this and the international aspects of it. Is China going to actually be able to create the tech national champions that it wants through this mechanism? I have friends who work on, say, the chip sector and others, and they think it is largely a failure. And that those that are more competitive, that have a variety of sources of capital and have to compete on different terms, don't get government procurement, they're the ones who succeed even within the Chinese market. So the real question is, at what point does the Chinese economy really start to run into more barriers as a result of this choice to go in the more statist direction? I don't think you're going to see a fundamental change until that assessment is made. I don't think any outside influence is going to make that much of a difference. And that's why I think maybe a more positive agenda needs to be out there, at least in the US case. I think things like TPP, working through WTO with partners. I think those are the kinds of things where you structure the incentives differently so that domestic reformers who want to push in the direction that many in the US and Europe would like to see have a chance. I think that's longer term. So I am pessimistic in the near term, but I think in the longer term, this process and possibility of economic reform is real.
We can take more questions. Yeah, we'll take more questions.
My name is Randy. I much enjoyed this discussion. It reminds me a bit of the discussions we had some 38 years ago, but then the country was called Japan.
Yeah.
But there is one fundamental difference which I think hasn't really got a lot of attention, and that is that nowadays there's a lot more intra-industry, intra-firm trade. I mean, the discussion smells a bit like, I export to you and you import to me. That's not the world that we live in. So I think that makes it much more complex, and also I think it should be a reason for optimism, because obviously when everything is so interdependent, if something goes wrong, everybody gets hurt, not just the exporter or the importer. Anyway, if you allow me, Mr. Chairman, I have two questions. One to the panel and one to Ms. Åsenius. The first one is about investment screening. That sounds great, except that, of course, if you engage in investment screening, you have to agree on the scope, that is to say, which areas, above which level, etc. And you have to have criteria. I mean, you test something against something. The national interest has been mentioned. I think there's one thing that is extremely ill-defined. It's the national interest. So if you start doing that, you end up with a lot of discussion, many of them political. And thirdly, you have to think of alternatives. This is a discussion that has been going on in Germany, where companies have been bought by the Chinese, and there was a lot of outcry, but then what? A more recent example, a big example, is Japan, where there was a sharp display that was, Foxconn from Taiwan wanted to buy a sharp display, and that would have been the biggest foreign investment in Japan, and the Japanese government did everything they could to avoid this by putting together a consortium and everything, but they failed because nobody really wanted it. And then you get into the discussion, okay, either we go bankrupt or we sell to Foxconn, and in the end, sold to Foxconn, and I think you will get into similar discussions. It's not like, either we invest or we don't. It's either we invest or, you have a loss of, I don't know how many thousand jobs. So I think it would be nice to have some comments on that. And to Ms. Åsenius, a very short question. You're advocating the multilateral road when it comes to dealing with China. The problem is only that on the other side of the Atlantic, Mr. Trump is pushing the bilateral road, and he's doing a lot to undermine the work of the WTO. So my feeling is that somewhere these two approaches are going to clash.
Thank you.
My name is Rutger Ferchen, and I used to be a psychologist. I used to be a diplomat working also on international finance, and that led me to be a banker where I was in charge of capital risk analysis at SEB. That's underlying the 2 points I would like to make. And I'm happy to follow your questions because I think we are asking similar questions or similar points. My first is that the economic slowdown we now see in China is because of its application of its, the Japanese model of state-led export stimulated and bank financed development. Here we are seeing now very difficult financial structure in the Chinese economy with heavily indebted companies where risk capital is not lacking but very scarce. And that is part of the declining yield of investment. So we were seeing an increasingly difficult economic situation emerging in China, where the very strong current account surpluses and fiscal surpluses are now vanishing or turning into the negative. So China's situation is worse. That is my first point. My second point is that we are seeing a Confucian renaissance as part of the centralizing effort of the Communist Party, including Xi Jinping. What this brings with it is an aspect of weak property rights, for instance. And that is also another aspect where capital flight is emerging as another weakening factor in the Chinese economy. But at the same time also as an instrument for an investment. So, and the background to that is the need, the increasingly tight capital flow restrictions applied by the Chinese government, in which licenses are required for foreign investment, and these need to be done. I will be short. But behind this, I think, is also underlying that the Confucian Renaissance we are seeing applied as a tool of strengthening the Chinese Communist Party is now also used or a basis for the challenging of the multilateral world order. Because the Confucianism is based on bilateral values rather than multilateral values of equality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just say that the European Union is and will remain the most open economy in the world. We need foreign direct investments for jobs and growth and innovation. The condition for our openness is that investors respect our security and public order. But having said that, investment screening should be based only on security concerns and be a last resort when we have no other means available to mitigate the risks to national security. And it's national security, not national interest, which could be, I don't know what, anything. Of course, other countries define national security in a very peculiar way, not least the US right now, talking about the Section 232 investigations. I'm talking about the possible clash between the US policies and European ones. Well, I would say that the US policies are a bit contradictory. Yes, they're doing some things that undermine the multilateral order that we built together after the Second World War, which have benefited us all for decades. But at the same time, we are actually working quite well with the USTR, the US Trade Representative, his people, and also with Japanese Trade Minister and his people, to write new rules that we will table in Geneva on reining in industrial subsidies, for example, and I hope we will also make proposals on forced technology transfer. So it's a bit contradictory. I think the US is playing on several horses at the same time and see what can deliver, possibly. I don't think there is one grand strategy, but maybe you have more insights. Oh, sorry.
Just make some compliment to their comments here about the scope and criteria. The EU regulation sets the frames of those in Europe, but we must not forget that this regulation is somewhat contradictory, because it sets frames of something that is in reality the member country's own competence. And this is, of course, so hard to understand for a layman, and even for me that actually was working, negotiating the regulation. So there is, in my view, a risk that if China are acting too aggressive, the criteria for what is a security risk might differ in different countries. And then you end up having a mechanism that is supposed to take care of national security, but the end is about the level playing field. And I think the development movement is very much in the hands of China. And just one comment about the comparison with Japan. I've heard that comparison before, but we must not forget that Japan during the 80s primarily goal was economic and not strategic, political, national security and so forth. So China is a much more dangerous component in that perspective than Japan as a whole.
Well, I'll jump in on that last comment first. I actually think if we look back at the 80s in the US, you see even popular culture, I think there was a tendency toward the securitization of Japan's, the challenge that it was playing. It was ideological as well, because Japan, the way in which the state was involved in sort of industrial planning, that was deeply political. If we think about the way that the World Bank assessed the Japan miracle versus others. I mean, I agree that it was probably less securitized than now, but in part because Japan was an ally, and China fits in a different way now. So I think there are these interesting parallels. Lighthizer, was involved in the Reagan administration. We're hearing talk now of voluntary export constraints from both Japan and Europe on auto parts, and this is drawn immediately and directly from the 80s and Japan. So I think there's lots of crossover there.
Bad idea then and bad idea today.
Exactly. I see most of this as a misassessment of what Japan was about at the time, and it's a misassessment of what's happening in China, including on the strengths of industrial capacity and the extent to which that was actually the driver of either Japanese or Chinese growth now. But I do agree that at least the dimensions of it are quite different, and the fact that China is not a democracy versus Japan, that's also a difference. On the question of the sort of criteria, I find it very interesting, this language of strategic or critical infrastructure or technology. Who gets to decide? And different countries are going to have different ideas, but if you're self-interested, if I'm a business, if I'm a sector, if I have some stake in this, I'm going to argue very hard. I'm going to get all my lawyers together and say, and all my PR people, and say, this is strategic, this is critical, and your version of it is not accurate. So it lends itself to that, and it doesn't have to, but I see this potentially going in the direction of more protectionism than less, and potentially enriching or protecting people who are connected to the highest levels of power rather than others in the context, again, of the United States. I do worry about that. And my last thought on all of this, in terms of the banking side of things, Western, American, European, and other finance, venture capital, is deeply embedded in China's tech sector, and also involved in the way in which China's outbound investments are taking place, including through Belt and Road. Where does that fit into all of this screening? To what extent should countries be thinking about their own financial firms and multinational financial firms and the way in which they actually provide much of the financing for these? I don't see this involved in any of these discussions. So do they just get to do it while everyone else gets restricted?
I think you have to organize another seminar on that something.
Yes, but there is a national limit in the regulation, and that is the 10% FDI. So basically, the regulation only covers foreign direct investments and not portfolio investments. But that's where you start.
Yeah.
So
So there's a few more questions maybe than we started on. But I would like to take the opportunity and hope you join me in thanking the speaker and the panelists for the absolutely fabulous discussion. Secondly, I would also like to thank the US Embassy for co-organizing this with us. This has been a fantastic opportunity, and we hope that we will have many more opportunities in the future. So, thank you very much.